For 20 years, my mother played the tragic widow, swearing my father died in a drunken car crash. I believed her lies until a stranger sat beside me on a flight to Miami. She slid a faded photograph and a redacted medical patent across my tray table, shattering my reality. My father did not die by accident. My mother framed him to steal his research and build a billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire. Tonight, I will burn it down. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you for tuning in. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating and producing the content you love. If you find yourself captivated by today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our dedicated team can afford their living expenses and continue bringing these thrilling tales to life. You can easily help by scanning the donation QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the video description and pinned comment. My name is Thea Salinas. At 32 years of age, I had spent the entirety of my adult life burying myself in the rigid, predictable world of science. As a senior genetic toxicologist for Ethelgard Bio, my days were consumed by analyzing molecular structures, identifying cellular mutations, and predicting how synthetic compounds might quietly destroy a human body. Science was safe. Science made sense. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic, deeply fractured family I had left behind. I was sitting in the dimly lit cabin of a business-class flight descending toward Miami, my body aching with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion after a grueling 80-hour work week. The quiet hum of the aircraft engines usually acted as a lullaby, but sleep had entirely evaded me. Instead, my skin prickled with a strange, creeping discomfort. For the past 2 hours, the woman in the seat next to me had been staring. She appeared to be somewhere in her late 50s, dressed in a sharp, slate-gray blazer that suggested a life of quiet authority. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a severe knot, framing a face weathered by stress rather than age. She had not ordered a drink. She had not opened a book. She had simply angled her body toward mine, her dark, piercing eyes mapping the side of my face with an intensity that bordered on surgical. I tried to ignore her. I shifted in my leather seat, adjusted the airflow above my head, and stared blankly out the reinforced window at the endless expanse of black ocean below. But the weight of her gaze was suffocating. Just as I turned my head, prepared to politely ask her to look away, she spoke. "Eleonora." The word dropped between us like a lead weight, entirely freezing the breath in my lungs. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. Eleonora. It was a name that did not exist on my passport, my driver's license, or any employee registry at Ethelgard Bio. It was a secret middle name, whispered only in the darkest corners of my childhood memory by a father I had lost when I was merely 12 years old. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely a raspy whisper. "How do you know that name?" The woman did not flinch. She reached into her dark leather briefcase and withdrew a manila folder, her movements deliberate and precise. "You have your father's jawline," she murmured, her voice laced with a heavy, sorrowful resignation, "and his absolute refusal to look away from a threat. I am Rosa." I stared at her, my mind scrambling to process the information. The name meant nothing to me. "I am a federal agent specializing in medical fraud," Rosa continued, keeping her voice low enough to be swallowed by the ambient noise of the cabin. "But long before I carried a badge, I was simply Rosa Salinas. I am your father's older sister. I have spent the last 20 years pretending I did not exist." A sharp, cold panic flared in my chest. My father did not have a sister. My mother, Victoria, had always painted my father as an isolated, tragic figure, a brilliant but deeply flawed man who had alienated everyone around him before drinking himself to death and wrapping his car around a concrete pillar. That was the story. That was the foundational trauma of my entire existence. "You are lying," I snapped, my defensive instincts kicking in. "My father was an only child. He died in a car accident 2 decades ago." Rosa offered a sad, bitter smile. She opened the folder and slid a photograph across my tray table. It was old and slightly faded. its edges curled from years of handling. In the picture, a young man with my exact eyes was laughing, his arm slung securely over the shoulders of a younger, vibrant Rosa. But it was not the photograph that made my vision blur. It was the document beneath it. It was a copy of a medical patent, heavily redacted with thick black ink, yet the title remained perfectly legible. A novel synthetic compound for the reversal of neurodegeneration. The primary author listed was my father. He did not die in a drunken crash. Thea, Rosa whispered, her tone vibrating with suppressed fury. He was murdered by the legal system, orchestrated by the woman you call mother. Victoria did not build Oasis Health from the ground up through sheer business brilliance. She stole his entire life's work. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. The cabin around me seemed to tilt dangerously. Oasis Health was a billion-dollar pharmaceutical empire, an absolute titan of the modern medical industry, and Victoria reigned over it as an untouchable queen. She realized the monumental financial value of his neurodegeneration research. Rosa explained, tapping a rigid finger against the patent. When he refused to cut corners and rush human trials, she framed him. She planted falsified financial records, accused him of embezzling federal grant money, and manipulated the board to strip him of his laboratory access. She sent an innocent man to a maximum security prison, where he died under highly suspicious circumstances just 3 months into his sentence. Once he was gone, Victoria patented his compound under her own name and built her empire on his grave. The air in my lungs turned to ash. Everything I knew, everything I had believed about my family, my wealth, my mother's legacy, and my father's disgrace was a meticulously crafted illusion. I had spent 32 years feeling ashamed of the man who gave me life, quietly accepting the emotional scraps Victoria threw my way, all while she bathed in the billions she had violently stolen from him. I had to disappear, Rosa said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Victoria had the money and the political connections to make sure anyone asking questions met a similar fate, but I never stopped watching you, Thea, and I never stopped building a case against her. Now, the time has come. The overhead speaker chimed, announcing our final descent into Miami, pulling me abruptly back to the present reality. But the reality I returned to was fundamentally altered. The world I knew had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I looked down at the faded photograph of my father, tracing the lines of his smiling face with a trembling finger. A terrifying, icy calm began to wash over the panic in my mind. For 2 decades, Victoria had worn the crown of a pioneer, a grieving widow who turned tragedy into triumph. Tonight, she was hosting a lavish gala to celebrate the 20th anniversary of her bloody empire. The wheels of the plane hit the tarmac with a violent jolt. I carefully gathered the photograph and the redacted patent, sliding them into the inner pocket of my blazer, pressing the evidence of my mother's sins directly against my heart. I disembarked the aircraft with a singular, burning purpose, walking briskly through the bustling terminal. I pulled out my phone and canceled my reservation at the luxury hotel. I did not need a place to sleep. I needed a rental car. I was driving straight to the Lion's Den. The coastal breeze of Palm Beach usually carried the scent of salt and freedom, but tonight, as it swept over the sprawling terraces of Victoria's mega mansion, it smelled strictly of imported truffles and unbridled greed. The Oasis Health 20-year anniversary gala was in full swing. Valets scrambled like obedient ants, parking an endless stream of European sports cars, while a small army of private security guarded the wrought iron gates. I stepped through the towering mahogany double doors, the weight of the photograph and the redacted patent burning against my ribs. The grand foyer was an obscene monument to vanity. A massive chandelier of Venetian glass dominated the vaulted ceiling, casting a fractured, icy glow over the hundreds of pharmaceutical tycoons, hedge fund managers, and corrupt politicians mingling below. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated the sea of silk and diamonds, offering crystal flutes of champagne that cost more than an average family's monthly rent. In my simple slate-gray wool suit and sensible loafers, I looked like a stray dog that had wandered into a pedigree show. That was exactly how they wanted me to feel. For 30 years. My designated role in this family was the disappointing, plain backdrop against which their dazzling success could shine even brighter. Well, look who finally decided to descend from her ivory tower of test tubes. The voice was coated in synthetic honey. I turned to see my younger sister, Isabella, gliding toward me. As the director of public relations for Oasis Health, she was the golden child, a perfectly engineered product of Victoria's ambition. She wore a backless emerald evening gown that draped over her lithe frame, diamonds dripping from her ears like frozen tears. Hooked onto her arm was her husband, Julian, a freshly elected state senator whose perfectly styled hair and blindingly white smile masked a soul completely devoid of moral substance. Isabella let her gaze travel slowly from my unkempt hair down to my scuffed shoes, her perfectly painted lips curving into a smirk of pure pity. "Thea, darling, we thought you would not make it, but honestly, you could have at least tried to dress for the occasion. We are celebrating 2 decades of medical innovation, not attending a funeral for a middle management accountant." Julian chuckled, a dry, grating sound. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned in, the cloying scent of his designer cologne invading my personal space. "It is good to see you, Thea, though Isabella is right. The press is swarming this place. We have image standards to maintain. You walking around looking like you just crawled out of a public transit station is not exactly a winning optic for the family." I looked at them, truly looked at them, with the newfound clarity of a woman who had just realized the entire foundation of her life was built on a graveyard. The anger inside me was a quiet, cold, and absolute thing. I did not say a word. I simply stared, watching their smug expressions falter ever so slightly under the weight of my silence. Before Isabella could launch another verbal dagger, the low murmur of the crowd abruptly hushed. The string quartet stopped playing. A path cleared through the center of the marble hall, and there she was, Victoria. She descended the sweeping spiral staircase with the effortless grace of an apex predator. She wore a striking crimson gown that commanded the attention of every camera lens in the room. Flashbulbs erupted, capturing the benevolent smile she plastered on her face for the public. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs and locked eyes with me, that smile vanished entirely, replaced by a gaze of cold, absolute authority. She glided toward our little circle, trailing a gaggle of reporters and photographers. She did not ask about my flight. She did not comment on the dark circles under my eyes or the visible exhaustion etched into my posture. "Thea," Victoria said, her voice projecting just loudly enough for the nearest journalist to hear, "I am so glad you could take a brief pause from your little laboratory experiments to join our family's triumph. As you know, tonight is not just about corporate success. It is about giving back. I have the foundation's ledger right here." An assistant materialized beside her, holding a velvet-bound checkbook and a solid gold pen. "I expect your contribution to the Oasis Family Charity Fund to reflect the immense gratitude you owe this family," Victoria continued, her eyes boring into mine with a silent, threatening command. $50,000 should suffice for the initial press release. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon our immediate circle. The reporters leaned in, hungry for the spectacle of the wealthy philanthropist and her allegedly ungrateful daughter. $50,000. It was nearly half my yearly salary, demanded on the spot, purely to buy her a headline in tomorrow's morning papers. I kept my hands firmly at my sides. "No." The single syllable fell from my lips flat and definitive. The assistant gasped softly. Isabella's jaw tightened, and Victoria's perfectly sculpted eyebrows twitched in barely concealed rage. Julian stepped forward, closing the distance between us until he was mere inches from my face. The polished politician vanished, revealing the street-level thug beneath. "You are going to take that pen, and you are going to sign that check right now. Thea," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for me. "If you embarrass your mother in front of these cameras, I will personally make a phone call to the board of Athelgard Bio first thing Monday morning. You will be blacklisted from the scientific community before you even finish your morning coffee. Do not test me. Know your place and write the damn check. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Hundreds of elite guests watched in hushed anticipation, waiting for the familiar, pathetic scene to unfold. They were waiting for me to lower my eyes, to flush with humiliation, and to quietly surrender to the sheer, crushing weight of Victoria's power, just as I had done every single day for the past 30 years. I looked at Julian's flushed, angry face. I looked at Isabella's arrogant sneer. And finally, I looked directly into the dark, hollow eyes of the woman who had framed my father and danced on his ashes. I did not bow my head. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I threw my head back and laughed. It was not a chuckle. It was a loud, sharp, echoing laugh that tore through the heavy silence of the marble hall like a jagged blade. The sound bounced off the Venetian chandelier and shattered the fragile illusion of their perfect night. It was a laugh utterly devoid of fear, vibrating with the terrifying promise of total destruction. The takedown had officially begun. My laughter finally subsided, leaving a ringing void in the grand hall. The flashes from the press cameras had completely stopped. The reporters stood frozen, their recording devices still pointed directly at us, capturing a moment that was rapidly spiraling out of Victoria's ironclad control. The string quartet, who had briefly attempted to resume playing, dropped their bows as if their wooden instruments had suddenly caught fire. "I owe you nothing," I declared, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings, sharp and entirely unwavering. "I will not contribute a single dime to a family whose entire existence is built on a foundation of intellectual theft and the blood of innocent people." The collective gasp from the surrounding elite was intensely audible. A few wealthy socialites whispered frantically behind their hands, their eyes darting rapidly between my plain suit and the matriarch's crimson gown. The pristine, highly engineered image of the Oasis Health dynasty was cracking live on camera. Julian's face flushed a violent, mottled red. The polished veneer of the promising politician cracked wide open, exposing the panicked, desperate amateur beneath. He frantically signaled to the edge of the room where the private security detail stood at attention. "Security! Get her out of here right now. She is clearly intoxicated and causing a severe public disturbance. Escort her off the property immediately." 4 burly men in dark suits began to push aggressively through the sea of expensive evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. I did not back down. I took a deliberate step closer to Julian, forcing him to hold his ground or look like a coward in front of his wealthiest donors. "Call them over. Julian, let them drag me out in front of the press. But before I leave, perhaps the investigative journalist standing right next to you would love to hear exactly where the millions of dollars in donations to the Oasis Family Charity Fund actually end up." Julian froze, his hand, suspended in the air to wave the guards over, slowly dropped to his side as if the muscles had been entirely severed. "That is right," I continued, raising my voice so it carried clearly to the very back of the massive room. "The charity is a massive, coordinated sham. It does not fund pediatric neurological research. It does not support underprivileged community clinics. It is a highly sophisticated dark money pipeline. Victoria funnels tens of millions of untaxed corporate profits into the foundation. The foundation then miraculously donates massive, unmonitored grants to a completely obscure nonprofit organization registered in Delaware. And would you like to guess who sits on the secret board of directors for that specific Delaware entity?" I locked my eyes directly onto my brother-in-law, watching the sweat bead on his forehead. "It is a shell company, explicitly created to illegally finance your state Senate campaign. Julian, you bought your political seat with laundered pharmaceutical money. Every single television advertisement, every campaign rally, paid for by fraudulent charity write-offs." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a massive structural collapse. The reporters were now furiously typing on their phones, the scent of a career-making political scandal filling their lungs. "You are insane," Isabella shrieked, shattering the tension. She threw herself forward, her hands dramatically clutching her emerald necklace as if she had been physically struck by my words. Tears, perfectly calibrated to elicit maximum sympathy, welled in her eyes. You are completely delusional. Thea, you have always been sick with jealousy. You could never stand the fact that I have a beautiful marriage, a highly successful life, and that I am actually loved and respected by this family. You chose to be a miserable, isolated lab rat. You are making up these horrific, baseless lies because you are deeply pathologically envious of my reality. She sobbed loudly, leaning heavily against Julian's shoulder. It was a masterclass in public relations manipulation. She was playing the wounded, innocent victim to discredit the whistleblower, a tactic she had successfully used against me since we were teenagers. But I was entirely immune to her theatrics now. Jealous? I replied, my tone flatter than a hospital heart monitor flatlining. Isabella, your entire life is a heavily subsidized fiction. You do not have a marriage. You have a legally binding co-conspirator. And as for your beautiful, wealthy life, it is about to be violently repossessed. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my blazer. The crowd shifted nervously, but I did not pull out a weapon. I withdrew a neat, meticulously organized stack of legal documents, printed on thick, undeniable bond paper. While you were busy picking out designer gowns and organizing these lavish parties, I said, holding the papers up to the light so the nearest cameras could capture the official seals. I have been living on a tiny fraction of my corporate salary for the last 10 years. I did not buy luxury vehicles. I did not take expensive vacations to Europe. I saved every single penny. And 6 months ago, when your little Delaware shell company took on massive, reckless short-term leverage to cover up a gaping hole in your campaign financing, I used my savings to quietly purchase that debt through an anonymous, third-party broker. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly embalmed corpse. His political arrogance evaporated into pure, unadulterated terror. I own the debt. Julian, I stated, my words striking him like physical blows. I am your primary and largest creditor, thanks to your reckless spending over the last 30 days. Your company is currently in severe default of the loan covenants, and at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I am filing the legal paperwork to execute a total asset freeze. Your campaign funds, your joint bank accounts, your private investment portfolios, and the deed to your summer home, every single liquid asset you and Isabella share will be locked down indefinitely. Isabella let out a genuine, unscripted gasp of terror. The crying victim act vanished instantly, replaced by raw financial panic. She grabbed Julian's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket, but he was too paralyzed to comfort her or offer a defense. It was then that Victoria finally moved. The benevolent philanthropist, the grieving widow, the untouchable queen of Oasis Health. All those carefully crafted masks shattered completely. They fell away to reveal the ruthless, cold-blooded predator lurking beneath. She stepped directly into my personal space, ignoring the flashing cameras completely. The air around her practically vibrated with lethal intent. "You arrogant, ungrateful little wretch," Victoria hissed. Her voice was no longer meant for the public. It was a low, venomous frequency meant to annihilate my spirit. "You think you can walk into my home and play financial chess with me? You are nothing. You are a disposable pawn." She pointed a rigid finger directly at my face, her eyes burning with a demonic fury. "I built this empire from dirt. I have federal cabinet members on my speed dial. I own state senators, federal judges, and regulatory commissioners. By 12 o'clock noon tomorrow, I will make exactly one phone call, and your scientific credentials will be permanently revoked. You will never set foot in a laboratory again, and then I will unleash my entire legal team on you. I will have you indicted for criminal extortion, corporate espionage, and criminal defamation. I will bury you so deep in a federal penitentiary that you will forget what daylight looks like." She leaned in closer, her breath smelling of expensive champagne and pure malice. "You should have stayed in your little laboratory. Thea, you have no idea what kind of war you just started." I did not flinch. I held her deadly gaze, absorbing the full weight of her hatred. "You are right, Victoria," I whispered back, ensuring only she could hear the finality in my voice. "I started a war, but I did not come here to fight it. I came here to end it." Before Victoria could draw another breath to hurl her final threat, the heavy floor-to-ceiling velvet drapes covering the grand windows were suddenly bathed in a frantic, strobing wash of crimson and cobalt. The relentless red and blue police lights cut violently through the darkness of the estate, painting the manicured lawns and the marble statues in the highly aggressive colors of a sudden law enforcement raid. The low, rhythmic, thumping bass of approaching armored tactical vehicles rattled the crystal champagne flutes resting on the silver catering tables. The towering mahogany double doors, which had graciously welcomed the wealthiest and most powerful elites of the eastern seaboard just a few hours ago, did not swing open gracefully. They were violently breached. A deafening, percussive crash echoed through the massive hall as heavily armored federal agents flooded the opulent foyer. At the absolute helm of this tactical formation strode Rosa. She had traded her understated slate-gray blazer for a heavy, reinforced Kevlar vest bearing the bold, yellow letters of a specialized federal task force. The sheer, kinetic shockwave of the sudden intrusion paralyzed the entire room. Hundreds of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and high society socialites froze completely, their expensive drinks suspended in midair, entirely unable to comprehend the sudden, violent invasion of their untouchable sanctuary. Victoria, ever the masterful and terrifyingly quick chameleon, adapted to the chaos in a fraction of a single second. The venomous, calculating predator vanished into thin air. In her place stood a fragile, deeply terrified widow. She dramatically pressed the back of her diamond-clad hand to her forehead, her breathing suddenly shallow, erratic, and perfectly calibrated to project vulnerability. "Officers!" Victoria cried out, her voice trembling with expertly manufactured distress. She pointed a shaking, meticulously manicured finger directly at my chest, her eyes wide with fake terror. "Thank God you are finally here! You must arrest this woman immediately. She is my estranged daughter, and she is having a severe, violent psychotic break. She broke into our private family gathering. She is raving mad, and she has been aggressively threatening our lives for the past 20 minutes. Please, I beg you, remove her before she physically hurts someone in this room." Julian eagerly chimed in, miraculously finding his political courage now that men with guns and badges were present. "I am a sitting state senator, and I formally demand you apprehend her right this second. She is a deeply disturbed individual attempting to extort our family." The tactical agents did not move a single muscle toward me. They did not raise their automatic weapons, nor did they reach for their steel handcuffs. Instead, they simply fanned out, forming a rigid, impenetrable perimeter around the sweeping staircase, effectively trapping Victoria, Julian, and Isabella in the dead center of the hall. Rosa stepped forward, her dark, uncompromising eyes locking onto the woman who had single-handedly destroyed her brother. "Nobody is arresting Thea," Rosa stated, her voice cutting through the rising panic like a cold, surgical scalpel. I calmly unbuttoned the front of my plain wool suit jacket. From the inner breast pocket, resting right next to my father's redacted medical patent, I withdrew a heavy solid brass and leather credential wallet. I flipped it open with a sharp flick of my wrist, letting the heavy gold shield catch the blinding, fractured light of the Venetian chandelier hanging above us. "I am not just a genetic toxicologist working in a dark laboratory at Ethelgard Bio," I announced, projecting my voice so that it carried clearly over the murmurs of the terrified crowd. "For the past 4 years, I have been working under a classified directive as a senior toxicology investigative advisor, embedded deeply within the oversight division of the Food and Drug Administration. My specific federal mandate is the detection and prosecution of systemic synthetic biochemical fraud." The color drained from Victoria's face so rapidly, she looked as though she had been entirely drained of her blood. Her jaw went slack. The gold shield shining in my hand was the one tangible thing her billions of dollars could not buy, manipulate, or crush. You genuinely thought you won when you locked my father away and stole his patent, I continued, taking a deliberate step closer to my mother, forcing her to look at the undeniable proof of her impending ruin. But my father was a brilliant, highly meticulous scientist. His original compound, the exact one designed to successfully reverse neurodegeneration, required a highly unstable, incredibly rare biological substrate. It was notoriously difficult to synthesize. It took many months to cultivate in a controlled environment. When you stole his life's work and launched the first iteration of Oasis Health, you quickly realized that mass-producing his actual functional formula would drastically cut into your precious profit margins. I turned away from her and faced the captive audience of investors and reporters, making absolute certain the press cameras captured every single syllable of my condemnation. So, Victoria did what she always does when faced with a moral obstacle. She compromised the truth. She completely abandoned my father's original, life-saving formula. Instead, she commanded her captive chemists to synthesize a drastically cheaper, heavily altered chemical variant. She replaced the active biological substrate with a highly synthetic, profoundly addictive molecular chain. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the hundreds of guests. The wealthy investors, who had built their massive personal fortunes on the soaring stock prices of Oasis Health, began to physically back away from Victoria, as if she were radiating a deadly, contagious plague. The flagship drug you have been peddling to the global public for 2 decades does not cure neurological decay, I stated, my tone absolutely clinical, precise, and utterly devoid of mercy. It masks the immediate symptoms while secretly flooding the human brain with a proprietary, unregulated addictive agent. It ensures that the vulnerable patients feel a temporary euphoric relief, practically guaranteeing they will return to their doctors for refill after refill. But on a microscopic, cellular level, your cheap chemical substitute is a highly volatile toxin. It slowly, systematically calcifies the neural pathways. You did not cure millions of suffering patients, Victoria. You chemically enslaved them, and then you slowly poison them to death to guarantee a lifetime of recurring corporate revenue. Lies! Isabella screamed, her voice cracking wildly under the sheer, crushing weight of the impending destruction. You have absolutely no solid proof of any of this. Oasis Health is a massive, publicly traded pharmaceutical company. Every single thing we do is highly regulated by the government. Regulated by the corrupt politicians your mother regularly buys with laundered campaign funds, I shot back, silencing my sister instantly. But digital data does not take bribes. Isabella, for the past 6 months, while you all continue to treat me like the pathetic, underachieving failure of the family, I have been systematically exploiting the very security clearance Victoria gave me to access the deepest Oasis Health archives. I used my completely unmonitored, low-level laboratory credentials to quietly bypass your incredibly arrogant external firewalls. I tapped the breast pocket of my jacket again, staring directly into Victoria's wide, terrified eyes. I have absolutely everything. I extracted the original chemical blueprints. I downloaded the falsified clinical trial results where your lead research scientists blatantly ignored the skyrocketing patient mortality rates. I secured the highly encrypted internal emails where Victoria explicitly, in writing, ordered the adverse reaction data to be permanently erased. I have thousands upon thousands of pages of internal corporate communications proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the entire executive board knew the drug was a lethal, highly addictive neurotoxin. The grand room began to spin into absolute, uncontrollable pandemonium. The investigative reporters were shouting rapid-fire questions, the relentless camera flashes were physically blinding, and the wealthy, elite guests were actively scrambling toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive, career-ending fallout of the largest medical fraud in modern history. Victoria stood completely paralyzed in the center of the chaos, the fragile, glittering illusion of her glorious empire finally crumbling into irreversible dust beneath her designer heels. The grand marble hall, just moments ago a sanctuary of unimaginable wealth and privilege, instantly devolved into a spectacular display of primal, animalistic panic. The moment I uttered the words, outlining the lethal medical fraud, The collective instinct for self-preservation overrode every rule of high society etiquette. The elite guests, the very architects of modern American capitalism, began to violently stampede. Billionaire investors shoved elderly socialites out of their path, trampling discarded designer heels and shattering crystal champagne flutes beneath their frantic shoes. They clawed their way toward the heavy mahogany doors, desperate to escape the blinding flash of the press cameras and the incoming federal indictments. They were no longer titans of industry. They were rats fleeing a rapidly sinking, burning ship. Agent Rosa signaled her tactical units to let the guests run, their focus remaining entirely locked on the architects of the empire standing trapped in the center of the room. The unholy alliance that had ruled Oasis Health for 2 decades was fundamentally fracturing right before my eyes. Julian was the very first to break. The ambitious state senator took one look at the heavily armed federal agents, then at the furious reporters broadcasting this absolute disaster live to the entire world, and did exactly what a spineless opportunist always does. He threw his family directly under the speeding bus. "I had absolutely no idea about the chemical toxicity," Julian screamed, holding his perfectly manicured hands high in the air as he frantically backed away from his wife and mother-in-law. He practically sprinted toward Rosa, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. "I swear to God, I am entirely innocent. Victoria controlled every single aspect of the pharmaceutical manufacturing process. I am just a politician. Listen to me, agent. She has a totally isolated offline hardware server hidden in a reinforced vault beneath the West Wing pool house. It contains the master ledgers, the original offshore banking codes, and the unredacted clinical death tolls. If you grant me full federal immunity right now, I will physically walk you down there and give you the biometric access codes." "Julian, you absolute coward!" Isabella shrieked, her voice tearing her throat as she stared at the man she had married. Her perfect, highly curated life was vaporizing into thin air, and the man she had chosen was actively selling her mother to the federal government to save his own skin. I turned my gaze to my younger sister, watching the sheer terror warp her beautiful features. It was finally time to deliver the cruelest truth of all. "He is a coward, Isabella," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic shouting of the fleeing crowd. "But he is not the one who truly betrayed you. Tell me, do you remember when Victoria promoted you to the Director of Public Relations 3 years ago? Do you remember how incredibly proud you were when she insisted your name be listed as the primary executive signatory on all the expedited regulatory filings for the new drug variant?" Isabella froze. The frantic anger in her eyes was abruptly replaced by a hollow, creeping dread. She slowly turned her head to look at Victoria, who was glaring at Julian with murderous, unrestrained hatred, entirely ignoring her golden child. "You really thought she gave you that title out of maternal love," I continued, stepping closer to my trembling sister. "You thought you were the chosen successor, but Victoria knew the federal authorities would eventually notice the soaring mortality rates. She needed a legally binding buffer. She strategically placed your signature on every single document authorizing the distribution of that lethal toxin. She did not groom you to be the next queen of Oasis Health. Isabella, she meticulously engineered you to be the ultimate disposable scapegoat. When the federal indictments inevitably came down, you were always going to be the one taking the fall while she retired to a country without an extradition treaty." The realization hit Isabella with the devastating force of a physical blow. Her knees buckled completely. She collapsed heavily onto the cold marble floor, the emerald silk of her designer gown pooling around her like stagnant water. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a raw, agonizing wail of pure despair. Finally understanding that she was never a beloved daughter, she was merely a human shield. The sound of Isabella weeping snapped whatever fragile restraint Victoria had left. The polished, elegant matriarch completely vanished, replaced by a feral, cornered beast. With a shrieking roar of pure fury, Victoria lunged violently across the marble floor toward Julian. She crashed into him, her manicured nails digging savagely into his cheeks. tearing deep, bloody tracks down his face as punishment for his treacherous betrayal. "You worthless parasite!" Victoria screamed, spitting venom as she clawed at the screaming politician. Two heavily armored federal agents immediately rushed forward, grabbing Victoria by the shoulders and forcefully hauling her off the bleeding senator. But the physical assault was nothing more than a calculated, desperate distraction in the brief, chaotic scuffle. Victoria had successfully snatched Julian's secured master smartphone from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. She wrenched herself backward, evading the agents for just a fraction of a second, her thumbs flying across the digital keyboard with terrifying speed. "You think you have won, Thea?" Victoria spat, blood from Julian's face smearing across her own perfectly powdered cheek. "You think some copied files on a federal flash drive are going to destroy my legacy? Those copied documents mean absolutely nothing in a court of law without the original, encrypted master files to verify their authenticity, and those master files belong solely to me." She slammed her thumb down on the glowing screen. Instantly, the massive, high-definition projection screen hovering above the grand staircase, which had previously been displaying the golden 20-year anniversary logo of Oasis Health, glitched violently. The corporate logo dissolved into a stark, blood-red background. A massive digital countdown timer appeared in the very center of the hall. 60 seconds. 59 seconds. "I just initiated the wipe protocol on the central mainframe," Victoria declared, a breathless, maniacal laugh escaping her throat. She tossed the phone onto the marble floor. "It is a military-grade, completely irreversible remote data incineration sequence. In less than 1 minute, the offline server in the vault, the offshore backups, and every single digital footprint of my empire will be permanently reduced to untraceable, corrupted ash. Without the origin data, your little federal task force has absolutely zero legal foundation to convict me of anything." The red light of the massive digital clock bathed Victoria's face in a sinister, triumphant glow. She stood surrounded by federal agents, her empire crashing down around her, her family entirely shattered. Yet she smiled. It was a cruel, sickeningly victorious smile of a monster who truly believed she had just outsmarted justice one final time. The digital clock looming above the sweeping staircase ticked downward with a ruthless, silent rhythm. 45 seconds. The red light from the massive screen washed over the grand marble hall, casting long, demonic shadows across the panicked faces of the remaining guests. Isabella was still curled on the floor, her agonizing sobs echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Julian was completely broken, kneeling with his hands pressed over his bleeding face, muttering frantic, useless prayers. Yet, amidst the absolute psychological wreckage of my family, I felt an incredibly strange, profound stillness. I did not panic. I did not shout. My mind was as cold and clear as a winter morning. I calmly bypassed the heavily armed federal agents, my sensible loafers clicking quietly against the polished marble floor. I walked deliberately toward the central security and audiovisual control console, an intricate panel of glass and steel hidden discreetly behind the main reception podium. 30 seconds. Victoria watched me approach the console, her chest heaving with adrenaline. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. "You are completely wasting your time. Thea, the central mainframe is guarded by AES 256 military-grade encryption. It is the exact same protocol used by the Department of Defense. There is absolutely no algorithm on this earth that can brute force that firewall before the countdown reaches 0. You have lost." I did not bother looking at her. I reached into the side pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small, encrypted solid-state drive. I slid it smoothly into the master terminal port. The control screen immediately recognized the external device, flashing a stark white prompt demanding the master override password. 20 seconds. "You have always been so remarkably arrogant." "Victoria," I said, my fingers hovering over the glowing digital keyboard. "You truly believe that because you successfully stole the chemical formula, you actually understood my father's genius. You viewed his science purely as a financial asset. You completely ignored the poetry of his work, the foundational biological architecture that made his compound functional in the first place. 15 seconds. What are you talking about? Victoria hissed, the supreme confidence in her voice finally faltering, replaced by a sudden, creeping edge of doubt. The active biological substrate, I replied, my eyes locked on the blinking cursor. The one you replaced with a highly addictive synthetic poison because it was too expensive to cultivate. My father derived that original neuroregenerative compound from a highly specific, incredibly rare species of the black orchid. He spent 5 entire years sequencing its unique genetic code. It was his absolute masterpiece. It was his life. And you, a complete outsider who only understands profit margins, would never even think to look at the raw biology. In seconds, I began to type. I did not enter a standard combination of letters, dates, or numerical security pins. I typed out the exact, highly complex molecular chain of the black orchid's defining DNA sequence. It was a flawless string of scientific data, committed to my memory since the day I discovered his hidden research journals in the corporate archives. 5 seconds. 4 seconds. I hit the enter key. At exactly 3 seconds remaining, the massive digital countdown timer simply froze. A deafening mechanical hum echoed through the grand hall as the system aggressively processed the command. The stark, blood-red background on the projection screen instantly vanished, replaced by a calming, brilliant blue. A single word flashed across the high-definition display in bold white letters: terminated. The remote data incineration sequence was completely dead. The white protocol had been entirely neutralized. Victoria's arrogant smile shattered. The breath left her lungs in a hollow, agonizing gasp. I did not stop there. I typed one final, rapid sequence into the console and slammed the execute button. The central audio system chimed softly. Federal data synchronization complete, a mechanized voice announced. Instantly, the massive screen above the staircase erupted with a cascading waterfall of highly classified, unredacted evidence, falsified clinical trial results, offshore banking ledgers detailing millions of dollars in bribes, internal emails explicitly ordering the suppression of patient death rates, and finally my father's original, unaltered biological patent. Everything was currently being broadcast in high definition for the press cameras, while simultaneously uploading directly into the secure evidence vaults of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sheer magnitude of her defeat hit Victoria like a physical, crushing weight. Her towering pride collapsed completely into a state of silent, paralyzing horror. She did not scream. She did not fight. She simply stared up at the screen, her eyes wide and completely vacant. Finally realizing that the invincible empire she had built on a graveyard was officially gone, Agent Rosa did not waste another second. She gave a sharp nod to her tactical team. The federal agents moved in swiftly, the cold, heavy steel of their handcuffs clicking aggressively around Victoria's wrists. They did the same to Julian and Isabella, violently hauling all 3 of them off the polished marble floor. My mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law were dragged out of the opulent mansion like common street criminals, surrounded by the blinding, relentless flashes of the press cameras. I stood completely alone in the center of the grand foyer. The air inside the mansion suddenly felt incredibly light. I turned around and walked slowly out the shattered mahogany front doors. The cool, salty breeze of the Atlantic Ocean washed over my face. I reached into my jacket and touched the faded photograph of my father one last time. I took a deep, unrestricted breath of absolute freedom. Tomorrow, I would use the billions in recovered assets and the rightful ownership of the original patent to finally manufacture the cure he always intended. I was ready to build a new, honorable legacy, one that would make him proud. Thank you so much to all the wonderful listeners for joining me on this incredible journey today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please let me know in the comments. If you found today's story thrilling and want to help our channel survive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the donation QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or pinned comment of this video. Your generous support allows our dedicated staff to afford their living expenses, feed their families, and continue creating these amazing stories for you to enjoy. Stay safe, and I will see you in the next one.